I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. Published in the Sunday edition of the San Antonio Express News, immigration reporter Silvia Foster-Frau wrote that, quote, "All along the border, immigration agents are watching," in a piece that reports that the U.S.-Mexico border is the most fortified in the Americas and one of the most militarized in the world, with federal and state taxpayers having poured billions of dollars into equipment and manpower to search for unauthorized immigrants, terrorists, and drug traffickers. At the same time, the U.S. is engaged in its largest government shutdown ever over funding for a wall President Trump says is needed to protect the country. So to discuss all that, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News immigration reporter Silvia Foster-Frau, talking about that recent article and the research she did along the border to write it. So Silvia, you're a regular here on the In-Depth podcast. It's great as always to have you back again to discuss an issue that's currently affecting Texas, the entire country. You recently again returned to the U.S.-Mexico border to research this issue. Tell me about the time that you recently spent there.
Yeah, so last week I spent a couple days right along the border. I started in Rio Grande City and then kind of made my way east from there all the way down past Mission to McAllen and Hidalgo. So those are all South Texas cities that are kind of right along the border, kind of right there in the heart of where all the border security and money and efforts to secure our southern border are. I was pretty much there to just check out, what kind of security is already in place. The idea behind the wall is kind of based on this notion that we have an open border and that drugs and crime and terrorism and illegal immigrants are just pouring in. And so I just wanted to see for myself, what that area is actually like and just how secure it is. And, through that kind of observation and then my own research, you can see that we actually have a very, very fortified border. Wall aside, there's blimps in the air, just driving from Rio Grande City, you see these huge aerostat balloons, they're called. They look like huge blimps that are in the air for radar detection. There's border patrol and state troopers, and then, your county and city local law enforcement, and they're all kind of there and patrolling and around. Then there's all the things that you can't see, ground sensors. You can't see the towers with cameras about them. So it pretty much just, my article just paints a picture of all the technology that's in place now to help secure the border in this larger debate about whether or not a wall is needed.
Before we get to that question, let's step back a little bit. In that article you just referenced, you wrote that efforts to fortify the boundary between these two countries goes back decades. So generally speaking, tell me about the history of this U.S.-Mexico border that's brought us to where we are today.
Yeah, so that part is really interesting to me. So it really also depends on the type of immigrants that we've seen coming and how the U.S. has chosen to react, and also about kind of the world events that were happening to the U.S. at the time. So, I'll just go back to the early 2000s when we had mostly Mexican immigrants that were coming across the border for work. And that changed during that time. A lot of these immigrants were pretty much just apprehended by agents and then turned around and just kind of scooted over the border, just kind of pushed back into Mexico when they were caught. And so that was happening for a while, just that kind of, there were no charges brought against these immigrants. They were basically just turned around and sent right back. That started changing for two reasons. One begins with a former U.S. rep. His name is Sylvester Reyes, and he was Border Patrol chief at the time in McAllen and then El Paso. And he started this operation called Operation Hold the Line, which basically, in an effort to reduce these kind of illegal crossings that were happening much more frequently, he had a wall of humans, of agents, pretty much stand in El Paso at the border and block these illegal immigrants from coming across. And it actually caused became a national headline because a lot of these workers were actually, gardeners and help from the El Paso side of the community. And they were like immediately kind of blocked. But it basically just changed the national conversation of border security from, or just like security from illegal immigrants, from looking at a place of apprehension to looking at a place of deterrence and stopping them before they even enter. And so that's when everyone started focusing on, instead of looking inland and ways to solve the problem of illegal or undocumented immigrants across the country, they focused on that border and how do we stop people from coming across. So that was kind of one aspect that changed the way that the US thought about border security. And then another, of course, was after 9/11, fears of terrorism and crime became heightened. And again, there was that focus on the border as a way to prevent those things from happening. But like we'll talk about later, a lot of the fears and a lot of the problems aren't actually best solved by the border, because a lot of the problems don't necessarily stem from drugs and people coming across the border. But I'm sure we'll get to that later.
Yeah, we'll definitely cover a lot more ground in this interview. One thing I want to jump on here, though, is you mentioned a wall of a different kind, kind of a human wall. So talking about manpower on the border, from time to time, National Guard troops are sometimes dispatched for temporary duty there. These are things that have happened recently, and they'll probably happen again. But normally, there are a ton of people involved with border security at any given time. Tell me about that.
Yeah, and that number has increased dramatically. So in my article, I talk about how in 2000, we had 9,212 Border Patrol agents. By the 2017 fiscal year, that number more than doubled to 19,437. So we're talking about a huge, dramatic increase in agents and people along the border. And all of so we have these federal border patrol agents whose duty is to secure the border and look for crime and drugs by illegal immigrants. And then you also have in Texas our own kind of separate state funding. So in the last legislative session, we secured $800 million, so close to $1 billion for border security, which involves our own state troopers. And so you kind of have this federal and state layering of both technology and manpower patrolling and working along the border.
Jumping to a different topic that's just been briefly mentioned, the idea of illegal crossing versus coming in other ways, including legal ports of entry. That's something that happens quite a lot. And also, specifically, you wrote about the smuggling of drugs. Those are coming in more often than not through legal ports of entry rather than, these borderlands in between that, there's no physical boundary, maybe there's not someone there who can actually see it. Tell me about the different levels of the crossing of drugs that you found.
So when I spoke with even the former Customs and Border Protection Commissioner, Gil Kurlikowski, he, as well as several lawmakers along the border, have advocated for more border security money to go towards the port of entries, because a lot of the majority of the drugs coming into this country aren't being smuggled in through the rural or unguarded illegal entryways, but through these ports. So all along the border, there are these bridges that allow for a transaction between people and for trade, and those are considered like legal entries. So if you're an asylum seeker, they encourage you to go through these legal ports and ask for asylum. And it's through those very bridges that they've shown that like 90% of heroin and 80% of cocaine, just the great majority of drugs are coming through. So it's not necessarily the areas where they would want to put up a wall, these illegal kind of rural parts, but in the legal ports of entry that the drugs are going through undetected. So a lot of the lawmakers down there are talking about, well, what can we do to update our technology, update and fortify these ports of entry to make sure that the drugs aren't coming through there. And, even the McAllen mayor, Jim Darling, he said that the bridge, the Hidalgo bridge that McAllen, the city, owns, he said they have like 1960s equipment. So he would really like to see some of that updated so that they can have a better control of these legal ports.
You just mentioned asylum seekers, and just a moment ago, you talked about the history of border crossings and also the recent history of how they've been reacted to in the United States to where we are now, which to go back to asylum seekers, that's something that is getting more and more every day, more requests for asylum than before. You wrote that that's resulted in very long wait times at those legal ports of entry we just mentioned, also further burden the nation's already overloaded immigration courts and detention centers. I'm just guessing that's worse now than before with the current government shutdown. So tell me all about that.
Yeah, so that's been a really big change in the demographics of immigrants that are coming to this country. It's no longer, mostly male, mostly Mexican men looking for work. It's now more and more families coming predominantly from Central America that are seeking asylum. And so that's kind of a game changer too when it comes to the US response, because you have these facilities that even federal officials have acknowledged, they're not designed to hold families with young children. They're more designed for these, unaccompanied young males seeking work. And so because of that, I mean, you saw in December, there were two migrant children that died. And so it's really now about, okay, we have people who aren't saying that they're coming here for work. They're coming here because they're fleeing for their lives. And so you'll hear a lot of Democratic lawmakers and activists talk about, this isn't about border security. This is about a humanitarian crisis for how do we take care of these people who have traveled over 1,000 miles, already fleeing violence, going through this arduous journey, coming to the United States. And then what can we do to care for them while their legal process for claiming asylum in this country occurs. And so we have these facilities that are becoming overcrowded. We already have a huge backlog in the processing, so it oftentimes takes years for asylum claims to like fully process and go through. And so that's also kind of a larger conversation when you hear about humanitarian crisis. It's about, what can we do for these families who are trying to come here legally. And so that's a really also important distinction between illegal and legal immigrants. And it often gets, I think, conflated in the conversation as one and the same, when really you have there's a whole kind of different population right now coming in and trying to seek legal entry into the United States.
And while you were down near the border recently, were you able to speak to any of these individuals? I'd love to hear some of their stories.
So I didn't speak to any recently released immigrants, at least not this time. I mean, I have in the past, and what you always hear of is stories of, I mean, really truly just horror, of brothers and sisters being kidnapped and killed, of families being split apart. When I was down there covering the family separation issue, I did a story about the asylum seekers that are camped out on the bridge, kind of waiting for their turn to be processed in the U.S. and they're just camping out there, and that's still going on, with nothing. They have maybe a backpack, they just have the clothes that they're wearing, and they're basically just sleeping on these bridges that are supposed to be pedestrian bridges for your regular people that commute with work visas and that kind of thing, and they're just waiting out there for their chance to be in the U.S. And their stories are really heartbreaking. I don't think anyone would dispute that. And so when you talk to those families, it comes down to, what can we do for them to make sure that they're being treated fairly and within their legal rights to it once they get to the United States.
So everything we've talked about so far, I think, has been kind of traditional ideas of what immigration, illegal immigration to the United States is. But something that's interesting and something that I've seen reported a lot, both with the Express News and other media outlets, talking about the border wall and the shutdown, is that people who are overstaying their visas rather than crossing a southern border into the United States, those numbers within the last, I think, something like 7 to 10 years, they've really flipped. And now the visa overstays is actually the higher number, correct?
Yeah, so ever since 2007, visa overstays have exceeded those entering illegally. And so that's kind of another one of the broader misconceptions that I think us at the Express News and other news media outlets have been trying to stress is if you're concerned is the undocumented immigrants in the country, the first place to look, where the majority of the people are living. The reason why they're living here undocumented is not because they're coming through the border illegally, but they're actually coming legally with visas and then overstaying them. So once their visas expire, they just don't renew, and they're living in the population illegally. So that's kind of one of the main misconceptions, and one of the things that you'll hear a lot of people talk about as to, well, why aren't we looking at this population and how we can fix this issue, since it's clearly more pressing than the illegal immigrants coming across the border. So, and then you also have the issue that even most crime and acts of terrorism hasn't been caused by undocumented immigrants. Most of these immigrants aren't committing crimes, because when you think about it, why would they want law enforcement to catch on to the fact that they're living here illegally? And so you have the fact that most crime and terrorism isn't being caused by undocumented immigrants, but by citizens. You have the fact that most undocumented immigrants are here because of visa overstays, not because of border security. And then when you look on the drug aspect, you see that most drugs are coming through legal ports of entry, not through the rest of the border. And so when you put all those together, you'll hear a lot of activists and Democratic lawyers saying, so why, and even former officials at CBP saying, why this focus on a wall when you have all these other ways that you could be addressing these critical problems in the country.
So, Silvia, all really good points that are definitely part of this overall conversation. But now, just maybe to play devil's advocate, kind of represent a different thought process. Many pundits, high-profile Democrats, government officials, like you just said, they'll say the wall's too costly, it won't even work. But at the same time, the U.S.-Mexico border already has miles and miles of walls, fences, other structures that we've been talking about, drones, lots of manpower down there. So while a 100% border wall on the southern border may not stop every illegal border crossing, it will certainly not have a large, if any, effect on people overstaying their visa. It probably would have some effect on decreasing illegal entry into the U.S. So that being the case, to say it wouldn't be effective overall, I think, is not necessarily truthful. And it's a really hard discussion to have, obviously.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you brought it up, because I'm in no way kind of advocating or saying that it's been proven that no wall isn't effective. And that's something that immigration experts that I spoke to, and former officials in the CBP agency have also expressed that it's actually can be very helpful in urban areas. So when former Congressman Silvestre Reyes, as a border patrol chief, when he did Operation Hold the Line and put people there, and then later he did advocate for fencing and wall along El Paso, and it did help. I mean, that, at least that's what he's telling me, is that in urban areas where you have these two twin cities, right? A lot of the U.S. Mexico border will have the U.S. city and then its Mexican counterpart, and they're right up against each other, but just separated by our border. A lot of times that kind of barrier and fencing is helpful. It does help deter people when they see a huge wall from trying to go that route. And the other rural parts of the U.S., I think, is where it's more up for debate as to whether or not a barrier is effective. When you have the deserts of Arizona that are already such a challenging environment, or you have the bluffs of the Big Bend here in Texas, or even in the Rio Grande Valley, where the environment is it's very difficult to construct a wall there because of the way the river kind of twists and turns and the other landmarks that are there. That's, I think, what's more up for debate than whether or not fencing or a barrier works in urban areas. And like you mentioned, we have 654 miles of fencing and border already up. And so far, all the Trump administration has done is just fix what's already been up. Though I guess people should know too that expected to start this February, bulldozers are coming into South Texas and expected to begin constructing more fencing that was allotted from a previous budget. And so there is still wall left to be built that has already been funded for. And I think there's a lot of consensus around the fact that in urban environments, in particularly where you have a lot of people moving out and you have these concentrated populations so close together, that there is an effectiveness there when it comes to having a barrier.
Silvia, we're wrapping up now. Obviously, there's a lot of issues concerning this big topic that we haven't even gotten to, like how it would affect the nature to have a complete border, physical border between the U.S. and Mexico. I've read a lot about people talking about the destructive force that could have. So obviously, there's a lot more to be discussed along this topic. But I just want to give you final thoughts before we say goodbye. You're obviously going to be covering this topic into the future. Perhaps something to end on. Is there anything else that you'd like to investigate that you haven't had a chance to really dig into deep yet?
Well, the next article that I'm working on is pretty much about the environmental and communal effects of the wall in the South Texas region, which is more our area of coverage. The wall that's planning to be built in February will be going through kind of protected habitats and also historic sites along the border. And because of the kind of authority that the US government has in the borderlands. We didn't talk about this too much, but the government has kind of extended powers there. They can construct that wall and waive. The plan is, I think, to waive 28 environmental regulations in order to expedite the process of this wall. And they can also the government can exercise eminent domain power over private lands that are there. So I'm going to be taking a look at the environmental and personal for these ranchers, and then also kind of historic communal effects of building a barrier through this particular slice of Texas. I think in the Rio Grande Valley, it's 33 miles that are going to begin construction this year. And so just looking about what kind of impact and reverberations that has in these communities, and weighing, whether or not the cost and benefit of those, is this going to help prevent an illegal and undocumented immigrant problem, a drug problem, or is it going to cause more harm than good? And I'm hoping that can help shed some light for people on the cost benefit of building more barrier.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News immigration reporter Silvia Foster-Frau for joining me with great details for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.